Hey, we're back, and I have for the base now. What I've done is I've given this a coat, as I mentioned, of primer, and as you can see now, what I've done is I've mounted it on a piece of board. Now this is for my molding process. Now actually I'm using MDF, but other people use acrylics. My technique is usually kind of I put it on MDF, and then this is a piece of acrylic card that it's mounted onto. So as you can see, I have now completely sealed this onto the board. Around the outside, I have also kind of sealed it underneath, because you don't want the silicone to go underneath the actual the model that you're molding. So yeah, I've kind of sealed that with a little bit of fine clay. You need a clay that is doesn't contain any sulfur, because that will react with the silicone. So this is the base. What I've done is I've also worked out the dimensions. So I'm going to need around about what is it, 1085 mil of silicone. So that's silicone plus hardener, and so I'll come on to that in a minute. But what I've tried to do is I've tried to give it enough edge around the outside and depth around the outside, so the silicone is going to be a nice chunk of a kilo of silicone that will then hold that shape, so that when I pour the resin in and pull the mold, it doesn't bend and it doesn't tear. So we've got a good definition here around the outside, as I mentioned. So some really good detail here along these stones where the sand has come up on the stones. And this branch that is just a piece of old twig really has got some really nice texture in the grain of the wood there. What I've also done is I've smoothed the sides, so these two sides here are very smooth, so it will enable a modeler to put a card up here or material and then lay the resin flat to give you a water effect. So thinking about what you're going to use it for in the process is important too. So as you can see, the stones have come, nice and hard. The primer gives it a even coat, but it also protects it from the silicone. So as I mentioned, I've got a thin piece of styrene, which I've mounted onto the MDF board here. And I have got the sides, which are made of MDF as well. And what I've tried to do is I've sealed them with a clear varnish, and that just gives it prevents the silicone from adhering. Most people use styrene or clear acrylic, but actually you can use MDF as long as it's not a textured MDF, because the textured MDF will then stick to the silicone. So if you're using a smooth MDF or you've coated it like I have in a varnish, then the silicone will not stick, and you can pull the mold quite easily. Now I've got my vacuum pump here, ready to degass. I've mixed the silicone. As you can see now, there's loads of bubbles in it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to pop the lid off, put that inside the pot, put the pot on, make sure that this is off, and I'm going to turn on. And then I'm going to slowly start to degas. Now what you'll see is you'll see the bubbles start to appear. I need that down to -1 atmosphere. And we'll open it all up. Keep this valve closed, so this is the release valve. And as you can see, they're starting to release the bubbles immediately in this process. So it's not even at 1 atmosphere, it's really coming up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reduce down that a little bit so it doesn't overflow. And it's just a careful process of really just letting these bubbles come to the surface. There we are, it's Just releasing this there, so there's a bit more atmosphere out. Get it down only to 1. What you want to do is you want to release the air out as much as you can. As I mentioned, you know, the more bubbles you have in the silicone when you're pouring it, you're going to have defects in the mould. You know, there'll be air bubbles actually when you cast the resin, and you don't want that. So the important thing that you need to do now is just make sure that you're taking out as much of this excess air, because when you've stirred it, when you've mixed those two chemicals together, the catalyst and the actual silicone, you know, that's what gives it the pink colour here. Yeah, the important process of that is you're mixing air in as you're doing it by hand, and there is no simple way of getting air out unless you have one of these. As you can see, it takes a few minutes. And the curing time on this silicone is about 12 to 24 hours. So what I'll do, once I've poured the mould, I will then simply leave it overnight, and we'll come back to it tomorrow. But I wanted to show you this process now. So you can see lots and lots of bubbles coming out. Turn that off for a second, release some of this air out, and you'll see it immediately go smooth. And actually I'm going to turn that back on, open up the valve to try and degas. As you see, this is coming up to -1 atmosphere again, but there's very few bubbles now. So those bubbles that I've just released were on the surface, they got sucked out through here. And right now we're just waiting, and you can see a few bubbles inside. I don't know if you can see there, and not very many now, and that's down to 1 atmosphere. And it's good to put it in a slightly bigger pot, because obviously you saw it foam up. If you're mixing a small batch of silicone, then you can use a smaller container, but just be cautious that it doesn't bubble over into the pot. So I'm just going to give this a few more minutes, and what we'll do is we will then pour it directly into the mould. Close that off, shut the pump off, let the pressure out slowly. Okay, put that there, just lift the lid, and you can see now the resin's really smooth, no bubbles in there at all. I'm just going to move the pot out of the way, and we're going to have our mould. I'm literally going to pour it into a corner, smooth as anything. There's a few bubbles coming to the top, as you can see. You can't remove all of them. Try and get rid of them. So everything's curing in the corner. I've washed my hands and everything, cleared up a bit, and it's going to take around 12 hours. They do recommend between 12 and 24, so I'm going to leave it overnight and I'll come back to it around about this time tomorrow. So I'm going to give it a good 20 odd hours to cure, and I'm doing that because I really want a decent mould from this. And then I'm going to pull the master from that, and then I will clean the mould. And then from that I'm going to make an initial cast, and the initial cast is usually the best, but also it'll pull any impurities and stuff also are left in the mould from the primer or anything else as well, so anything that I didn't clean properly. Cleaning the mould is important, but I'll come on to that later. So I'm going to leave it, and we'll see you later.